I had been, as I said, I'd been growing for a lot, but my professional life was as a filmmaker. I studied filmmaking and I became a producer. In the 70s, I did have an organic market garden in Devon, and I very quickly realized that then trying to grow organic red Brussels sprouts or yellow courgettes was the fastest way to go bust I could ever have dreamt. And I decided that actually it was much better I was much happier just growing for the pleasure of it. And so I ended up traveling the world, and would find myself in places a bit like the photograph that you see, this image that you see with all the blurb on the front of it promoting the book. But the image is actually of a young girl, and she is gathering spring onions. And she's from the Hmong tribe in Laos on the Mekong River. And I had spent some time traveling down the Mekong. And I was really interested in what they were growing and how they were growing it. And this image, in a way, to me, just completely conjures up not only how intimate people's relationship is with what they grow and eat, and how culturally diverse they all are. And this girl reminded me of when I was a little kid going to collect vegetables from the garden. But here she is growing her spring onions 8 feet off the ground, because rooting around in amongst the village and in amongst all the vegetable plots that the Hmong have were pigs and chickens and you name it. So in order to be sure they had a crop, they'd grow a lot of their food on these platforms. And so I have been traveling all over the place, but not really thinking about seeds or food culture until I found myself in the late 90s, the late 80s rather, in Donetsk, of all places. And I was there making a TV series about the town, which had been founded by a Welsh industrialist called John Hughes, and the town was known as Yuzovka. And when I was there, it was right at the dying days of the Soviet Union. The Ukraine only got its independence in '92. But this was a crumbling steel town, and it was a polluted mess and a nightmare. And I had a director. I was producing the series, but my director was a vegetarian, is a vegetarian. And anybody who's traveled in the former Soviet Union will know that being a vegetarian is not easy. They just, you go to a hotel or a restaurant and it was all fat and meat and very, very little else. And the kitchen staff were not very happy with us being there. And they certainly didn't want to be told that they had to provide for a vegetarian. And I wasn't having any of this. So I disappeared into a market in Donetsk. And that was really the only place where you could buy fresh produce. And it was in this market that I met somebody who became an archetype. And this archetype appears again and again in my book, because I met her all over the world. And she was a woman, I mean, I call her in the book everybody's ideal granny. She was a sort of diminutive lady of a certain age, fairly fierce, but somebody who was growing her own vegetables in her backyard and selling them in the market to augment her meager pension. And she was growing varieties that her mother had grown and her grandmother had grown before her, had been in the family for generations. And back then, you didn't buy seeds, you saved them. Indeed, this woman was doing something that we used to do on a very regular, constantly, up until really the sort of development of the modern seed industry. Everybody saved their own seeds. And she had on her stall a pepper. And it looked quite fun and interesting, and it was quite pretty. And so I bought some, and I took them back to the kitchen and cut into one and ate it. And I was sort of blown away because it was a sweet pepper, but it had a wonderful fiery bite to it and very fruity. It was, I thought, magnificent. And so I thought, I'll better go back and buy some more the next day, which I did. And when I picked them up, I thought to myself, I wonder if I scrape some seeds out of this pepper and dry them on the windowsill of my bedroom, I could bring them back home and grow them. And I've been growing that pepper ever since. And it really was the foundation of my seed library, which is now about 500 varieties. And the pepper is really important. I mean, I devote a whole chapter in the book to capsicums, but within Ukrainian food culture, there are probably as many recipes with peppers in as there are babushkas cooking them. And it's ubiquitous throughout Eastern European cuisine and food culture, and particularly also in Russia. And so I was very used to eating peppers. And I kind of started to sort of think, actually, this pepper it's very important. It's a genuine heirloom. It's part of somebody's family and their story, but it's also intrinsic to Ukrainian food culture. And so after that, whenever I was traveling, you know, I was meant to be making films, but actually I used to send crews off, and I would disappear off into markets. I'd go and talk to farmers. I'd peer over garden gates at people's gardens, trying to find local varieties. And that was, to begin with, was not so easy because, you know, still the bulk of vegetables that are being sold are modern cultivars, and even back then, all modern cultivars. And it depended where you were in the world as to how many local varieties, heirloom and heritage varieties, were being grown. And this journey I've been on ever since, and it's taken me to a number of different places, and some of them are much closer to home than you think. So what I wanted to do with the book is to kind of tell the stories of a number of varieties of vegetables that I grow in my garden. And the book is in two halves. You have the vegetables, there are 14 altogether, and half of them originated from the east of my garden, and essentially the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East and the Eastern Mediterranean region. Not entirely, but most of them did, but from the east. And the second half of the book is devoted to vegetables that came from west of my garden, namely the New World, primarily from an area called Mesoamerica, which is sort of southern Mexico and most of Central America. And the stories, which really are telling the stories of these vegetables, how they were domesticated, how they went from wild parent effectively to cultivated offspring, how they were domesticated, and how they then became fundamental to, in fact, the story of civilization. To me, it's one of the great untold stories. You know, the vegetables are the Cinderellas of the food world, and we just don't think about them. And we go, and if we want peas, we just go into the supermarket and we buy a packet of frozen peas. Whereas in fact, and we don't know where they come from, and we don't know their name, and nothing. It's just a pea. But in fact, you know, the story of the pea is incredible because it was native to the Eastern Mediterranean and North Africa primarily. and it was domesticated over several thousand years and had various uses, originally as a dry pea. And it traveled east into India and populated basically the whole of the northern hemisphere, apart from the New World. And when we started to get systematic about breeding, because up until really the start of the Industrial Revolution, all of plant breeding was done by farmers. And it was a process of observation, trial and error. And this takes me back to when we first became settled farmers about 12,000 years ago. Those first Neolithic farmers who were looking at the wild crops that they were gathering and asking themselves the question, is there something, a quality, a trait that this particular crop has that means that I can store the seed, particularly with the founder crops of wheat, emmer wheat, chickpeas, millet, lentils, these types of crops. And in many ways, peas weren't any different. And this drive, which was the result of a number of things, climate change at that time, it was the end of the Ice Age, there was mass extermination of game, people were getting hungry, so they needed to find other sources of food, and there was an increase in population. There was lots going on which compelled people to really start to think about how they could grow and store food. And the pea I particularly like because throughout the 19th century, we became obsessed with it. And it makes the story of the pea, makes the tulip mania look like a sort of a child's party. It was nothing compared to how obsessed people were with growing, breeding, and developing peas. And the book is full of stories of the sort of ingenuity and deviousness of plant breeders, the sort of shysters and charlatans who were claiming peas for themselves, renaming them, creating stories around them that were going to appeal to right across America and UK and Europe, to an army of growers, particularly amateur growers, who were just mad about growing peas. Anyway, I digress. I was in the Garrocho region of northern Catalonia, which is in the southern Pyrenees, a few years ago. And this area, Spain, throughout Spain, but particularly in Catalonia, it's really interesting place to go and look at what the relationship people have with their local varieties. So, every village has its own bean, and these beans are at the center of their cuisine, and the farmers grow them and they sell them as dried beans. They create recipes around them, and they're fundamental to their sense of identity. Now, if you put a gun to my head, I wouldn't be able to tell you whether a Fesol de Santa, the pea of Santa Pau, of the bean of Santa Pau, was any different in flavor and quality to the Olot bean that is grown 20 miles down the road. But to the local people, one is worth eating, the other is rubbish. So they're incredibly proud of their food. And I was introduced to an extraordinary guy called Jesus Vargas, who is a bit like me and collects vegetable varieties, but he's only interested in what comes out of Catalonia. And he has a library of about 150 varieties of vegetables that are all specific to Catalonia. And that's everything from tomatoes to peas, beans, brassicas, you name it. And I went to see him, and I walked into he's an organic garden farmer, this wonderful, wonderful farm. And there was literally this forest of peas growing. And it was May. And you know what it's like. You go into a garden and there are these peas fat on the vine, begging to be picked. So I ate some of his peas, and they're magnificent, very big pods, actually big peas inside. And I wasn't sure that they were going to be any good, but they were unimpeachably delicious, sweet and flavorsome and fabulous. And I said to Jesus, look, tell me, what is this pea? And he said, well, actually, this pea was bred by my wife's grandfather and named after her grandmother, Avi Yuan. And so her grandfather was part of a generation that are sadly gone now of individual growers who were developing their own varieties extensively. And I said to him, I said, well, this is wonderful, Jesus. Could I have some to take home? And he said, yeah, of course you can. And I said, but what's going to happen to this pea? Who else grows it? And he said, well, nobody else grows it. It's just me. And so I said, well, what happens when you shuffle off this mortal coil, my good friend? He said, oh, I don't know. That'll be it. And I said, no, it's not going to be it, because I wanted to grow the pea. And I said, can I look at putting it into the Heritage Seed Library, and we will do some tests on it to see if it's distinct. And if it goes into the library, basically it's safe forever and a day and can be shared amongst the members. And he said, I'll be only too pleased if you do that. And I took the pea home with me, and bearing in mind, he hadn't staked them or anything. They were just growing, sort of ranging around his fields. When I got my peas back home, they grow to about 3 meters. I need to get the step ladders out to harvest them. And they're also wonderful because the bees absolutely love them. And although the pea is completely self-fertile and actually remarkably difficult to accidentally cross, so when a bee comes along to take the pollen, the flower has already been pollinated. So they can be visited by bees, and I don't get any crossing. And that's what I love about this pea, is it's incredibly tall. It's a mecca for bees in the summer, and which is great to have in the garden, fabulous pollinators. And then you end up with vast amounts of these very, very big peas stuffed, oh, I've gone the wrong way, stuffed full of lovely fat and delicious peas. And so his story, the story of Avi Yuan, is in a way it encapsulates something that was very common up until I think the 30s. The Second World War was where everything really changed. I mean, back at the end of the 19th century in the UK, the RHS, there were over 250 varieties of pea that were actually catalogued and registered with the RHS. In America, at that time, there were over 1,000. Now, they weren't all distinct. A lot of them were the same, but just had different names and had been grown in different ways. But that tells you how much diversity there was in our gardens just, 120 years ago, not even that long. I'm a great lover of deserts, and one of the places that I found myself in 2011 was in Syria, and I was there right at the start of the civil war. And I'd been making films in war zones. I wasn't particularly bothered about being there because I wasn't a target, and it was early days, and there were a lot of unpleasant youths in leather jackets wielding Kalashnikovs and trying to look tough, but there were no tourists. And it's always very nice to be in a country when there are no tourists around. And I was had gone to visit Palmyra, just because it's an incredibly important, Roman city, and there was nobody there. And I went to a little cafe that was near the main entrance to the site, and there I was presented with this incredible salad, and it was a salad of fava beans, and the fava beans were huge. They were the size of my thumb or bigger, and it was delicious. I loved it, and I thought, wow, these are fabulous. And I asked the chef where the beans had come from, and he said, well, I grow these beans, and they are I've been growing them for they've been in my family for generations. And I was very intrigued by this, because the fava bean, the broad bean, is one of the founder crops. It's one of the first crops that was domesticated, probably around between 10,000 years ago. Not as early as wheat, but alongside other pulses like chickpeas and things like that, it was being domesticated. And the oldest archaeological records of fava beans actually is in Israel, the oldest one, which is about 6,500 years old. And then there was another archaeological find in a village that in 1974 was submerged under the waters of Lake Assad. So they did some excavation before the village was ended up at the bottom of the lake. And there they found fava beans that were about 4,500 years old. And Palmyra is just down the road from Lake Assad. And it's also right in the heart of the Fertile Crescent. And you look at it now and you think this is desert and barren. But actually, back then, at the end of the Ice Age, it was moist and steamy, and it was incredibly diverse environment, a real center of diversity. And I thought to myself, I wonder just how old this bean is that I'd been given by this chef. And the thing about it is that fava beans are, if we eat fava beans, we tend to eat broad beans, as you know, and the idea is you grow a bean that's quite long and it's got lots of beans in it. And actually, fava beans, which are grown as forage crops, or in the Middle East grown to be dried and then eaten as a condiment, or you make them as forma damies. There's lots and lots of recipes using fava beans, dried fava beans, rather than fresh ones. The pods are much longer, but also the fava beans are smaller. Yet, when I took these beans back home to grow them, and they were very, very happy growing back when I started with these, this was in the Forest of Dean, you will see the pods were very short. And that didn't surprise me at all, because very, very old heirlooms and traditional varieties of broad beans are short. They only have sometimes only 2 beans, 3 beans in a pod, but they're normally very small beans. Not the case with this one from Palmyra. And these pods are just full of the biggest, fattest beans that you could find. And so this is absolutely distinct, but it's also, I think, one of the oldest beans. It's certainly the oldest broad bean I have in my collection. I have broad beans from all over the world that I've found on my travels. And again, it's what the story of the bean from Palmyra tells us is, first of all, it has a history that goes back to the very dawn of civilization. I mean, they were growing, fava beans in the very first civilizations 4,500, 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia. They were eating these things, and they were a part, they became absolutely a part of cultural identity. And in the book, it's full of stories and anecdotes about what people thought about beans, whether they thought they were good, bad, or indifferent, whether they were dangerous or not. I mean, poor old Pythagoras had suffered from Favism, and there was an attempt to assassinate him, and he had a choice to face his assassins or escape through a field of fava beans. And he chose to face his assassins rather than escape through a field of fava beans for fear of being struck down with Favism. Of course, he was killed. It was a bit of a Hobson's choice. Anyway, this bean I've been saving the seeds of, and as you can see, it's of a great size. And these seeds are now part of a project that I've been working on for some time, which is to return seeds to displaced people, so particularly Syrians. So I grow a great variety of different vegetables that I collected in Syria, and more by luck than anything else at the time. And then they are being grown out. And, if you know any Syrians, displaced Syrians living in the UK, get in touch with me, and if they've got gardens, they want to grow their own local Syrian varieties of all sorts of things, whether it's beans, tomatoes, chilies, you name it, cucumbers, courgettes, I'll gladly give them seeds. But a lot of these seeds have been going to Canada, to Portugal, to Denmark, and I'm now working with the Lemon Trust and with other people to actually return seeds to refugees in Jordan and Palestine to create their own seed banks and grow once again the varieties that are absolutely local to them. Now, as I said, I have a particular love of deserts, because back in the day when we were starting to domesticate and create our own indigenous food cultures, most of these places were rather more fertile than they are today. But there are notable exceptions, and this is a region of Oman, which is obviously right at the bottom of the Arabian Gulf, and it's the Saik Plateau. And the Saik Plateau it's about 1,800 meters high, and you can see from the photographs that it's full of terraces. And this was a region that very low rainfall, but incredible aquifers, and the most brilliant farmers who created these terraces that tumble 1,000 meters down the hillside. And what it's famous for today actually is musk roses. The rose water, the little bottle of rose water you buy to flavor your cakes with, has probably come from Oman. And I was there actually trying to escape from a nightmare filming job in the Middle East. And I was walking amongst these terraces, and I came across these terraces of garlic. And I love my garlic, and I grow lots of varieties, and I was really interested in it. And I returned to the hotel, and I talked to the owner, and I said, well, this is very interesting seeing so much garlic growing up here. And I said, what is it? He said, well, it's my garlic. Everybody I meet seems to have a farm. Anyway, it's his garlic. He'd been growing it, and his father and his family had been growing it for generations. And you had these native tribes up on the Saik Plateau who had been living there for a long, long time. And I asked him what he thought the provenance was, and he said, actually, he thought they were French. And I said, no, they're not French. I don't think so. And the reason I said that was because garlic, first of all, comes from Southern Asia and China. That's its homeland. That's what it's native to. And of course, what's been happening for thousands of years is that our ancestors have been trading up and down from southern India all the way up through the Arabian Gulf and into Constantinople. And this is why you had cities like Damascus, you know, the oldest city, probably the oldest city in the world, 4,500 years old. You know, it was there because there was all this trade going on. And of course, people from China or India who were basically traveling on boats originally, they would hug the coast all the way up the Indian coast. And then when they got to Oman, they would then transfer to camels and carry on up to Damascus and Aleppo and Constantinople. This was a really important trade route. And people needed to eat while they were traveling. And so they carried with them their native foods. And this garlic is, it has wonderful red skin. And when I was there in sort of April time, it was just coming ready to be eaten as fresh garlic. And the site plateau, you know, you think, gosh, in the wintertime it gets really cold there. It gets freezing cold, but it is very dry. And so the garlic is very, very happy growing there. It's adapted to growing in semi-arid, although these are irrigated, or obviously all of these terraces, but nonetheless in the wintertime it's very dry, very cold. They love it. And I asked my host if he would send me some garlic when it was ripe and dry, and he said sure. And I kind of forgot about it. And then in June, that June, I'd been away for a few days, and I came home and opened the kitchen door, and I was assailed by this wonderful aroma of garlic. And there, sitting on the kitchen table, was a huge sweet jar full of garlic, and the whole jar was covered in stamps, and there was an official customs form, and you know, it was all very kosher and stuffed full of garlic, and it was absolutely lovely to eat. And I thought I shared some. There was so much of it. And then I thought, I'm going to grow this garlic and see how it does. And so I grow it in a polytunnel. And it's the reason why I think it comes from China is because it's a stiff neck. So it has a scape. And the stiff neck garlics are the ones that are native to China. If you go to India, in parts of India, and particularly northern India, they don't think much of stiff neck garlics. They want to eat soft neck garlics, which have much smaller cloves. But as you can see from the picture, these things, they're magnificent, and they have these iron hard skins on them, you know, which you have to really smash with a knife to break into. I just had some tonight with my parasol mushrooms, absolutely delicious. But I plant them sort of about now, next week, in a polytunnel, and I don't irrigate them, and I just leave them in the polytunnel all the way through the winter. And they very, very quickly sprout, and they're incredibly happy. And I then start to pull them as fresh garlic, sort of towards the end of April. And by the time I've got to the end of May, they are absolutely ready for lifting and drying, but they're not very good keepers. So they are the first garlic that I eat through the autumn, and I will finish this year's crop. I mean, I will be planting some out soon, and then maybe I've got 10 garlic bulbs left. So that'll all be over sometime in November, and then I start on my next variety of garlic, because they will start to shoot quite late in the autumn. But again, the story of this particular garlic tells you something about how we've, as humans, us traveling around the world and taking with us the seeds and the plants of our homeland is how we've ended up with this amazing diversity of crops, which we then take ownership of ourselves. And I think never more so have we seen this in a particular crop, which I think is probably the most extraordinary vegetable that we eat, but is also demonstrates the genius of these Neolithic farmers who figured out how to domesticate and develop some extraordinary crops. Now, the Balsa River Valley is in southwestern Mexico, and it is famous particularly because in recent times, biologists and geneticists have been able to determine that maize, it is the center of domestication of maize. It's where maize was first domesticated. But right through, you know, for the last 100 years, actually up until really the 60s, 70s even, there was a huge debate about what was wild maize, how had maize been domesticated, and I love it. I mean, one of the things I like writing about is just how human we all are, how we all argue with each other and can't agree, and then reluctantly accept august opinion. But the scientific research on maize is fascinating, and what we have now know is that maize actually evolved from another grass of the same family as maize called teosinte. And teosinte doesn't look anything like maize at all. It's a sort of tall, weedy grass, and it has little seeds, corn-like seeds on it, but that's it. And yet, in its genetic makeup, in its morphology, it has some very, very interesting genetic traits, which mean that there only needs to be a mutation of 2 or 3 genes in the genome of teosinte, and it radically transforms. It changes its form completely. And obviously, what's amazing is that in the Balsa River Valley, they went from a boring grass into, which by the way is still grown and eaten, fed to cattle, to breeding, developing maize. I mean, Mexico has the greatest diversity of maize anywhere in the world. And you look at that photograph of all those different types of maize, and they are all have evolved from a series of short mutations of teosinte. And that again, I'm just in awe of how farmers, their observation, their curiosity, their hunger too, I have no doubt, what kind of drove them, motivated them to really observe what was happening to this grass that they were probably using to feed their cattle, because it wasn't really good for human consumption, and suddenly started to notice things changing, and then saved those seeds, and then and grew them again, and something else happened. And what's amazing about maize is that literally it went from teosinte to maize within a generation. It happened incredibly quickly. Unlike most of the sort of way that our domesticated crops have evolved, which is very slowly over a very, very long period of time. And the other thing about maize is that it's, you know, it's one of the 3 crops that keeps the world alive. You know, it's maize, rice, and wheat. And of course, we think of maize nowadays in the ghastly nightmare of monoculture and hybrid cultivars that are genetically narrow and fragile. They're the racehorses of the food business. They need lots of input. They need loads of water. whereas most maize grown in Mexico, which is not the wettest place in the world, don't. And this photograph this is one variety of maize that I grow. And you look at it and you look at all of those different colors, you look at the diversity, the genetic diversity of that maize, to me is amazing. So when I grow it, I've got no idea what one's going to get. And actually, it's a sweet corn. It's absolutely lovely. It's delicious. The problem is, I'm not very good at saving maize seed. You need big populations of maize, and you also need to keep it isolated, because windblown pollen will cross, which is one of the reasons why you have such an unbelievable diversity of maize. But the other thing about maize is that it is absolutely fundamental to so many societies. And I was while I was researching this book and writing about it, I've been fascinated by maize, and I've been growing a variety called blue Hopi maize, or Hopi blue maize. And in fact, I got the seed from the Seed Savers Exchange in America, and it was irrigated maize. And the Hopi, the Hopi Nation, which is in the middle of the Navajo Nation in Arizona, in a hyper arid, super dry part of the world, they don't irrigate their maize. And I was really interested to see if I could find some the real thing. And again, I think thanks to my sort of nose, my detective nose, but also having made lots and lots of documentaries over the years in all sorts of, amongst ethnic communities and minorities and indigenous people, I kind of knew, it's about treading sensitively and carefully. And the Hopi are very private people. You can't film them or photograph them. You can't even draw them. And so trying to find a farmer who I could talk to about their maize was not going to be easy. And the other thing is, the Hopi, like the Navajo, it's a matriarchal society. The women, they own the land, they control the communities, and they are the farmers. And anyway, there I am. I find myself in the second Mesa in the Hopi Nation in 2018. And there was this tumble down old shop selling knickknacks and Hopi memorabilia and stuff. And I walked in, and there, leaning on the counter of this store, were two men. One was a giant of a man, a Hopi Indian, and the other was this sort of little white guy who actually came from Ohio, or Kansas. And they were looking at a paper about teosinte and maize. And I kind of walked out, I said, oh, yeah, I don't believe it. You're reading all about teosinte. And so we got into a conversation about maize. And I said, is there still blue maize being grown in a traditional way in the Hopi Nation? And they said, well, of course there is. And there was a lot of noise coming from a kitchen at the back of the store. And in the kitchen was a lady called Janice Long, a Hopi. And she came out of the kitchen with her hands all white with flour she'd been baking. And her husband, who was the guy from Kansas, said, hey, this guy, he's really interested in blue maize. What do you think? And Janice kind of looked at me, and I said, I'm really interested in what it is you grow and how you grow it. And she said, would you like some seeds? And I said, I'd love some seeds. Thank you. And one of the things that I do when I collect seeds or given seeds is I have if I can, whenever I can, if I return somewhere, I always bring seeds back with me. I like to return seeds to the people who've given them to me. It's just completing a circle. And I said to Janice, look, Janice, it's really nice. And I'm really looking forward to trying and growing this maize, because the Hopi grow their maize in clumps. They don't grow them like we do in these huge, enormous fields, all equally spaced. They grow them in clumps of maybe half a dozen plants close together, like I did in this polytunnel, which wasn't irrigated. And they sow the seeds about a foot deep in the ground because they don't get irrigated. And she said, you can have the seeds, but promise me one thing. And I said, anything. She said, please don't bring them back to me. And I've got more than enough. And she also gave me some teepery beans, white Hopi teepery beans, which are again a bean that grows in hyper-arid conditions. But when I took these seed back, this is what I was able to grow. And they're magnificent. And I have a corn grinder, and I now can make blue polenta. But the interesting thing about blue maize is that, you know, if you are a young Hopi guy looking for a wife, the way you win her heart is through the quality of your blue maize. And so people are judged by how well they grow their maize, what is distinct about it. There are lots and lots of different varieties of blue maize, and they are fiercely guarded by families who spend a great deal of time working on them to keep them pure, to improve them. And this is a process that has been going on for thousands of years. And that maize to me is, again, it's a very important part of the story of our relationship with what we grow and what we eat. And I wanted to finish on another aspect of my work, which is trying to recover or extract varieties that are highly endangered, not because of things like war, which happened in Syria, which is just by accident that I was there, but Myanmar is a really interesting country, and I've been there and I've filmed there, and it's a country that was completely isolated, really, for 60 years at the end of World War II. And when you think that until World War II, the Irrawaddy Delta, 40% of the rice grown in the world was grown on the Irrawaddy Delta. And there were hundreds of varieties, local varieties of rice being grown there. Now, when I was on the Irrawaddy, there's very little, I mean, there is rice growing, but nothing like that amount. I mean, the Burmese are not exporting rice in the way that they were in the past. But Myanmar is an amazing place because you have this country that in the north, you have the Himalayas, and in the south, you're right down in the tropics. And so the diversity of things that are growing there is huge, but also it's a completely agrarian society. You know, I don't know, 85 or 90% of people in Myanmar live on the land, and the average size holding is about 5 acres, small. And until quite recently, everybody grew their own varieties and they saved their own seeds and they shared them. And this was how farming worked. Anyway, I'm in this little town called Sipor in Shan State, which is in northern Myanmar. And Sipor is a dusty little town on the road from Mandalay to the Chinese border. And there are these trucks trundling through, piled high with watermelon and hybrid maize that the farmers are now growing to supply the Chinese market. And of course, wherever I travel, what's the first place I go? I go to the market. And in the main market in Sipor, when I first went there, there were 4 or 5 women, and they had these big baskets, just like the basket you see the photograph of, piled high with these beans. And the beans would be cooked and people would buy them as a snack, and they'd pop the bean out of the pod and eat it a bit like we would an edamame bean. And the beans were, the riper ones I could see were quite colorful. And I asked my guide, what they were. And he said, ah, they're the angry bean. And I said, what do you mean the angry bean? And he said, well, if a pregnant woman eats this bean, it gets angry and it will stop growing. And that to me was such an interesting story, because it absolutely put that bean right at the heart of Shan culture. But I knew that this bean, I couldn't identify it, but I was pretty sure I knew what species it was, that it was a lima bean from Peru, from South America. And it hadn't been in Shan state for more than 500 years, because it was only when Christopher Columbus stumbled upon the New World that all of these amazing New World crops found themselves in all over the place. Anyway, his mum had some seeds, and I thought, oh gosh, I'd really like to try and grow them. And I also couldn't identify them. And so I tweeted about it, and then really interesting, a woman from Slovakia got in touch with me, and she said, I think I know what this is, because there's a woman in my village who grows this bean, and she'd been to America and she brought some seeds back with her, and funny enough, she sells them in the market. And she said it's the Christmas lima bean. And I then found a guy in America, actually in Texas, who was growing the lima bean, Christmas lima bean, and I showed him what I had, and I said, it's quite extraordinary how it grows. And I just had a few beans. This was how they looked when they were being freshly harvested. And when I took a few home and grew them and put them in my greenhouse, this is what happened. They went completely nuts. And I got this huge crop of these amazing beans, which I think they're the most beautiful bean that I grow aesthetically. But why was it called the Christmas lima bean? And the reason is because during the gold rush, the prospectors who moved to California, they needed supplies, and there were lots of sailing ships plying their trade up and down the west coast of America as part of the whole, globalisation that has been going on since the year dot. And what did they have in their holds of their ships to feed the sailors? They had beans. And where had they picked those beans up from? They picked them up from Peru, from South America. And they were grown in America as a survival food in the wintertime, hence the name Christmas lima bean, or lima, as they call them in America. But more important even than that is that this bean has been represented on pre-pottery, in pre-pottery indigenous archaeological sites. It's been around for thousands of years, 5,000, 6,000 years. And it is also seen on the early pottery from South America. So we're looking at 3,500-year-old pottery, which has got images of this bean on it. And that tells you how important it was to these ancient food cultures. And thanks to our ability to sail around the world, it has also found itself not only in Shan culture in northern Myanmar as the angry bean, but also in 19th century American prospector, the prospector world as the Christmas lima bean. And again, to me, what I'm fascinated about with these vegetables is, and the fact that I can grow them and they're delicious, is that they tell me a story about how vegetables have been part of our identity since the year dot. And I just wanted to finish with an image. This is my garden in the summertime, which is a garden that is grown. Sure, I eat lots of crops, lots of harvests, but I'm growing so much for seed, not just for the Heritage Seed Library, but for other gene banks and just for people who want seeds to share. And the garden is a memory, and that's why to me seed saving is so important, is that, you know, you buy a packet of seeds and you sow them and that's it. It's just a packet of seeds. You don't have a relationship with them other than that you've paid, you know, Dobies or Suttons or whoever it is, some money for some seeds. And you don't know where they've come from. They've probably come from China or Thailand, possibly from Spain. So they have no provenance. But as soon as you grow them yourself and save the seeds, you are connected to them. And that's very important. And so in this picture, what you see is a runner bean, the Montacute bean, which is from the Montacute estate in Somerset. It's an amazing runner bean. And then in front of that, is a broad bean that comes from Catalonia, Purple Queen, absolutely unique and distinct to Catalonia. And then the white flowers are of a French radish, a winter radish called pasque, which they used to lift and store through the winter and eat in the spring, Easter time, hence the name pasque. Nowadays, you don't have to lift them, just leave them in the ground because things have gotten warmer. And so I hope that that sort of gives you an idea of what I've been trying to do, and that all of these seeds that one collects and saves and shares are absolutely fundamental to our own sense of identity, as well as everybody else in the world. And that's my story.